Well, folks, by my clock, it is 7 o'clock, and so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping things for those who just got on. We'd like you to keep your video off, please. And down at the bottom of your screen there, if you run your mouse over it, there is a icon for chat, and you can go ahead and click on there and send questions in that way. We'll be monitoring that, and Dr. Tonsor will be handling those, as well as we have 5 other of our specialists that are on tonight: Brian Brigham, Dan O'Brien, Greg Ibendahl, and Michael Taylor. And so they can handle questions for other fields. But for now, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Tonsor and let him take off with livestock markets.
Well, everybody, good evening. I wish I was visiting with you in person and under a different set of circumstances, but nonetheless, thank you for joining us. What I've done here is I've pulled together a slide deck that hits what I'm going to call 30,000 foot level points. On lots of these slides, I have hyperlinks to the resources. I encourage you to dig into those more later. I'm going to try to plow through this and kind of give you my main points, kind of make the bottom line, take home points for you here, and then we'll field as many questions as you might have. So with that, let me just kind of plow right ahead. I want to start this by kind of setting the stage, and this is literally the first slide from the last market outlook talk that I gave, quote unquote, pre-COVID in the US. Yes, obviously the COVID issue was already on the ground, but it didn't blow up to the current scale. On February 21st, I was speaking to the Society of Rural Appraisers, and boy, howdy, do things change fast. And I'm noting this because everybody, not just the ag and livestock sector, is adjusting to many things for the first time in their life in many ways. And I think we have to keep that in mind. The supply chain is taxed, and that shows up in the marketplace. And even analysts and folks like me are taxed. So we're doing our best, and I hope you find this useful, but I find it useful to start there. This slide right here it's a bit messy, and I'm not going to read every number, obviously, but I do pull it together, again, a little bit for a homework assignment for you. Later, what you can do is, reading from top to bottom, you can see how the futures markets, is what I've summarized here, for different livestock groups, so live cattle, feeder cattle, lean hogs, and then I use class 3 milk for dairy, compare with the general equity market at key points in time, basically going back to the beginning of the year. And what I've done is I've picked 5 things along the timeline of the COVID experience, starting with the first publicly reported death in China, getting us down till when roughly 80% of US citizens were under lockdown at the end of March. And then I included information as of the close of business today for context. You'll see there's lots of variability and downward movement, of course. We're all aware of that. The punchline of that is seen at the very bottom of this slide. And you can see, for example, live cattle, feeder cattle, hogs, and milk, the April contracts respectively, all have declined by 20 to 40% between January 11th and today. So that's point number 1, is we have notable declines in these markets. Most of you know that. Another key point on the slide, though, is how is that different when we look out to the deferred markets? And I've put October up here because it's timely for each of these species, but also because October is a contract that is common to all 4 of them. And what I want you to notice is the declines on the deferred October contracts, while still negative and still not fun to deal with, on all 4 of these species and products are notably lower than the more nearby April effects. That in itself, I think, is telling, because the supply chain adjustment, kind of the inner supply shock, if you will, from this, most of that is filled in the nearby. We're kind of working through that. I would argue the market thinks they're going to plow through that somehow. The latter one is more of a demand effect, and demand is hitting both nearby and deferred. So the latter October effects are the demand, macroeconomic concerns. The nearby are those and the supply shocks that are hitting the market. To that point, I'm going to walk through a few resources. Again, highlight them, encourage you to come back and look at these more. One of the things I did back, I guess technically on the 21st, it feels like a long time ago, a few weeks back now, I was being asked a lot of questions about what the economic damage to the beef cattle sector was. That was before some of the more recent announcements on governmental stimulus were made and so forth. And I thought it was prudent that I put out something that was from the university that could be cited. And I did a quick and dirty assessment. I have 2 different broad approaches. What you'll see here in the text box before you go look at it is one of my broad approaches put the total estimate damages at right about $8 billion. One other one put it about $9.4 billion. What I really want to highlight here is this resource is being quoted a lot, and I hope it has been helpful in different ways, but it honestly is a chainsaw, not precise approach, but gives broad context kind of in the heat of the moment that the beef cattle sector, like lots of other sectors in ag, certainly have had massive market movement. And I was just trying to give context to that. I hope you find that resource helpful. As we move from the aggregate, kind of what damage has been done, to diving into the details about what more narrowly is going on and maybe why that's happening in the eyes of an economist, I think it's really important that we start with the whole point about supply and demand. Most of you have probably heard me or seen me in person, and you know I like to start my quote-unquote outlook talks summarizing the supply and demand situation. I'm not going to be long-winded about that here today, but I'm going to start with a really important point. Meat demand in the U.S. is much stronger when we have good economic times, and it's weaker when we have poor economic times. So in econ jargon, when the GDP and consumer incomes are going up, meat demand goes up, and obviously the reverse holds as well. What I have here is I pulled a table. To the top right, you'll see I've done a snapshot from the latest beef demand determinants work that I've done with Jason Lusk over at Purdue and then Ted Schroeder here at K-State. We looked at basically how elasticities, own price, cross price, and expenditure elasticities have changed over time. And I put a purple box in the middle. And the punchline is beef demand in particular is extra sensitive to the macroeconomic environment. And it's become more sensitive to that over time. That is particularly worrisome because most folks that are macroeconomists think we have a weaker macroeconomic environment today than we did 2 months ago. It's pretty hard to argue that point. And going forward, there's concerns about how weak that new reality of domestic economy as well as the global economy will be. And I would argue that's weighing on the entire protein complex. The second point I want to transfer over to is we're all quite aware of the discussion about how the food supply chain is working hard to adapt in the shift away from food service, as we're not allowed to go into restaurants. You can do takeout and carry out and drive-bys and those kind of things. Drive-through, not drive-by, excuse me, to focusing on at-home retail consumption. And we could spend hours on this. I don't have time for that, but I want to highlight a new resource. This is something called the Meat Demand Monitor. It actually started in February, so it is a new effort here at K-State. It's supported by both the pork and the beef checkoff. You'll see the link for it. I want to call your attention to a report that we put out on March 26th. That is called the COVID-19 Special Report. We're going to update that here in about 3 weeks. But one of the things that was in that report I want to highlight for you here is this figure. What this figure is it summarizes by week the data that's underneath that particular survey series, going back to it started February 12th, on at-home meal consumption separately for the breakfast, lunch, and dinner meals. And what I really want to highlight is the last two observations on this chart. When we move from the week of March 15th to the week of March 22nd, we see an increase in all three meals in the frequency of being consumed at home. This is not surprising. I'm just confirming what is in many ways the obvious. In about 3 weeks, we're going to see in the updated data set for April that's being collected as we speak, how much this has continued and so forth. But I want to use this as an example to set the stage for a lot of the shifts that are going on within the ag complex, and specifically beef and pork for most of my commentary here. I think most of our listeners know, and I've looked at the sign up, so several of you know this in much more detail and for more years than I do, is we raise whole animals and we produce a lot of different products. Some of those products traditionally largely go through food service, and some of them largely traditionally go through retail. When we have a shock, a once in a lifetime, I hope, kind of shock like we're living through, where one of those channels, in this case food service, is mothballed, so to speak, it creates notable challenges to repurpose quote unquote parts of the animal. And that's what we're seeing largely hit both the beef and the pork markets. So to set that stage further for the supply chain shock, I want to remind us that this has all happened real fast. The same presentation that I noted to kick this off, which is February 21st, I was highlighting this particular Economist magazine piece, and you guys can read from this. It was dated February 15th, and the Economist authors were talking about what will be the lasting impact on the global supply chain. Now, they were not talking specifically about meat and livestock. That's my job to kind of go that narrowly. But there's a lot of things in that article that I think have come to fruition, and I'm concerned about them. And I want us to be aware of that. So that's important to keep in mind. And I'm kind of baiting those of you that like to read The Economist to go read that particular article. So let's dive into the realities of the supply chain right now. And I think you can't hide from this. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the topic of plant closures and or slowdowns. Here's some examples I just pulled from the news today and yesterday. Go to the general news, not just the ag news. And there's more and more commentary about challenges that packers and processors are having responding to the current situation. First and foremost, these are places that have a large number of employees that traditionally do not stand 6 feet apart. So in the spirit of trying to be compliant with dealing with COVID, that is hard, no matter what species and what kind of system we're talking about. If you have a lot of employees that are used to being closer to each other, that presents a real challenge. I think the industry is doing the best it can to deal with that, but it's not surprising that this week we've had some unfortunate developments that are leading to, I don't want to use the term closure, but slowdowns and temporary pauses in running some of our plants. What are the economic impacts of that reality? Well, I'm not an epidemiologist to say what the spread of the COVID virus is going to be. I'm certainly not in the mind of the public health officials on when, public health and just general governmental officials on when the economy is going to be allowed to kind of ease back in. But the duration of those two combined is going to have a big factor on the market impacts of these closures and slowdowns. Specifically, how much they are slowdowns versus outright closures, and how much they are just rescheduling some maintenance. So there's some commentary about doing maintenance this week that was going to be done a month from now. To the extent that that's just swapping out, kind of cleaning things, doing maintenance, and we'll make up for it in a couple of weeks, that will mitigate some of the effects. There's still effects, but that helps mitigate some of the aggregate. The exact size, location, and number of plants involved certainly has an effect. Most of you know we have plants scattered around the country, clustered in some states more than others when we talk about beef and pork plants. For quick context, by my assessment, no one individual plant would represent over 7% of the national capacity. The Tar Heel plant in North Carolina would represent the largest one in the pork space, and it would crowd 7% of national capacity using some available estimates from the past. And then there's a handful of beef plants that would be 5.5% to 6% individually. So the ability to, absorb a plant, being, I won't say mothballed, but slowed down is there. But the uncertainty is how many of those plants and for how long are we talking about? The fourth thing on my list here that drives the economics of this particular discussion is exactly what bottleneck is building both before and after the processing and packing side of this. So how many animals are we stacking up? How many fed cattle and market hogs would we like to process that we can't? That's very dynamic and a function of everything I just said. And on the back end, what's the availability for storing the products as they come out? So what I mean by that is some of the products that traditionally would go into food service that don't fit into retail very well, what's the availability for storage there? That's a function of all these other things that we're talking about also. So that's what I mean by the bottleneck on both sides of the plants. I think the last thing I want to note on this particular comment is I noted the labor. It's really the labor availability and their willingness to work and their human health, not being ill. It's the combination of all those things. As we have economic dynamics about unemployment and protection if you lose your job and so forth, that complicates it. Certainly, as we have a little bit moving target about what CDC is recommending as you recover from COVID, that impacts this. So there's a lot of uncertainty on just labor availability that the sector is dealing with. That directly affects this. And then as I've tried to make the note, the food service to retail shift is a big part of that as well. That's the economic driver that is beyond just the labor challenge that also affects the economics of running the plants hard, so to speak. To that point, I've noted here is another article that talks about a quote unquote bacon backup. To give context, bacon historically goes through food service much more than it goes through the retail channel. So the shocks that we're talking about here are not favorable for bacon. And we're seeing that stack up, and you see that in the marketplace. And I want to use that point to translate over to some specific comments about the wholesale meat market. What this chart here is it's a summary of the pork cutout going back to January 1st. The red line is the composite, and you can see that we've had notable changes Loin is the only primal that is actually up since the peak run up. All the other primals have come down. And perhaps of most note, to fit the story on the last slide I just gave you, we now have belly and ham prices par with each other. So the dark blue line on the bottom is now running right along with the green line, which is ham. That is not normally the case. That is largely reflecting the current reduced demand for bacon that's associated with the inability to have food service. Lots of our hamburgers and food service have bacon on them. Lots of bacon obviously goes into breakfast through food service, so on and so forth. That is definitely a shock that shows up within the pork complex, and that is weighing on the market. Here's the parallel for the beef side. So same setup. I've got the choice beef cutout, calendar year 2020. The red line in the middle is the composite. You can see that the chuck and round are the two that have gained during this period. They're the two that are up since the middle of March. Those are the two primals largely associated with ground beef hamburger production. All the other primals are down. So in aggregate, I think beef demand is likely down, even though we've had a run on ground beef. The negative effect on food service more than offsets in a negative way, in my mind, the negative thing that's happening on the retail front. So adverse demand, back to my earlier comment about the macroeconomic environment weighing on meat demand, I would argue we're seeing that happen already in the wholesale prices. Last point here, this past weekend, I worked with Lee Schultz. We cranked out another fact sheet trying to assess the potential market impacts, specifically livestock price markets, if we pull down utilization of plants. You'll see I put a text box up here. Basically, at the end of the day, a punchline from our work is if we have 20% lower utilization of available plants, so if we take that much offline in the spirit of COVID in various ways, we project that's a 27% reduction in fed cattle price. And worse yet, that same 20% reduction is a 36% reduction in market prices for hogs. Why the difference? I would argue that the hog complex is dialed in a little more to the minute, to the hour, so to speak, and the cattle complex has a little bit more flexibility to alter their marketings. Both are certainly perishable. You certainly can't do that forever, but there's a little bit more flexibility in the cattle supply chain than the market hog supply chain, and therefore you have those more dire impacts. It's also important to note, we have this quote, and that's why I call your attention to it here in the purple text. We can't tell from the analysis we did here how much those negative effects were already priced into the market. So Lee and I were doing this work last Saturday, and most of you know the livestock markets were down notably last week. They've been up some and a little bit choppy at times this current week, but last week they were notably down. My best gut guess is some of that was exactly this issue, was the market was signaling we're concerned about this, but how much of that decline was already priced in is beyond the scope of our analysis, and I'm a little bit guessing on that. So that's all I want to spend until we get to the Q&A on that particular topic. Now I've got a few updates on forecast before I get really high level, 30,000 foot level on you. Here's some of the latest numbers from LMIC, Livestock Marketing Information Center, dated April 3rd, projections for the cattle complex. The past years at the top, 2020 is in the middle, 2021's at the bottom. All I want to really highlight, you can look at specific numbers later, is the 2020 numbers that are projected are certainly lower than they were pre-COVID. So if you compare these with LMIC's forecast dated early January, they're all down for all points during 2020. However, they are more optimistic than what the futures market would suggest. So that's an important note here. There's quite a bit of sentiment, not just by LMIC, but a lot of analysts, that the futures market is quote unquote overreacted negatively. We can talk about that if you want, but I'm going to highlight here the difference between the LMIC forecast is a little more optimistic than the CME would be. To round this out, I've put in the same information basically from market hogs and for class 3 milk, again from LMIC. So the last day in March, LMIC put out hog forecast for second quarter was 66 to 68 bucks, third quarter, fourth quarter. You can see those are all year-over-year declines. They would be lower yet if we were to update them today based upon how the market's changed since the 31st. And then looking out to 2021, they were expecting maybe an 8% improvement over 2020. Same general comment that I just made on cattle is the LMIC forecasts are certainly lower than they were pre-COVID. So there's a damage implied in that. But the LMIC forecasts are more optimistic using compared to what the CME is projecting. Similar story holds when you look at class 3 milk. You can read these numbers, Q2 and through Q4 for the rest of the year, down from where we were earlier in the year, but still slightly more optimistic than we are if you look at CME specifically. Now I want to leave you with a couple broader comments. First and foremost, I would argue that agricultural markets work like a pendulum in many cases. And I think we can look back to the August 2019 Tyson fire outside of Garden City, the Holcomb event, so to speak, and learn that. What I have here is the live cattle and feeder cattle futures contracts, specifically for the month of October. And you can see the effect of Holcomb, the limit down story that was there, and the eventual recovery as the market adjusted and became, quote unquote, comfortable adjusting to all those realities. It is way too premature for me to say that COVID has bottomed out and that the recovery is well underway or that it will happen tomorrow. But in general, I think markets do react hard to new news, particularly quite large, very surprising and bearish news, which is what has been hitting the markets for some time now. Large declines. And then they find a little bit of a bottom and then they come back up if the economic environment improves to support it. I anticipate that happening, but I am nowhere near smart enough to say if we're within a day of that or if we're 3 months from that. And that's what has a lot of people anxious, because in many ways that hinges on exactly how long the virus persists and how long the economy is mothballed, so to speak. Those are two of the biggest drivers of that in my mind. I'm getting asked a lot if there's any insights from the 1998 hog experience that are relevant for the discussion here. The answer is yes, but I'm not sure exactly which ones to highlight, so I'm going to highlight a couple. I'll remind us first and foremost that following the large hog market crash in 98, 99, that we had a large reduction in the number of quote-unquote independent operations and a big shift away from traditional negotiated cash marketing. In 1995, over half the market hogs were still being negotiated. And it was much lower than that shortly after 98, and we're below 3% regularly now. That development happened for a lot of reasons, but among them was the economic need to align effort and sort of gain access to a slot to process your hogs and be more comfortable with that story and so forth, was strongly revealed in the 98, 99 experience. As a sidebar, for those that don't know this, I grew up on a hog farm in Missouri. 1998 was actually my senior year. I'm pretty bald for my age if you're doing the math, but I remember this very well. One of the main implications that came from that event was we now have LMR. Some of you know it as mandatory price reporting. And I would argue that the hog industry experience had a lot to do with that. Ultimately, Congress implemented LMR April of 2001. We now have mandatory price reporting for multiple species, and not just for animals, but also meat. I was sharing some of that earlier when I gave you the cutout information. And every 5 years, we adjust this. I'm highlighting this because there's always big changes. In this example, how people conduct business, how the government's involved, how they report, and what price information is available for decision-making was notably impacted by the 98 experience. I think some aspects of that are likely to fall out from this as well, but I'm not bright enough to tell you exactly what they'll be. I anticipate that we will have additional profit squeeze that's sufficient that will further squeeze out some independents and those that did not have price protection in place. What I struggle a little bit more with is how we may or may not have changes in price reporting and price discovery. That's a little bit speculative at this point. I have 3 slides here I want to highlight some concerns I have, bigger picture, once things calm down, and I'll wrap this up. One is I think it's important to note that before COVID, so think pre-Christmas, populism was already growing, not just in our country, but around the world. Questioning the role of globalization is the way to think about that. And certainly during COVID, we have ramped up discussion and action to improve domestic security, whether that is on food or human health, medical supplies, or other supplies. There's definitely a lot of effort in that space. And one has to ask the question if this is going to speed up and persist into further steps away from globalization. Why do I highlight that? If that happens, that implicitly means less international trade. That would not be good for the U.S. ag sector. And for tonight, I'm talking specifically meat and livestock sector. I include here a table. I maintain monthly demand indices from the export front for beef, pork, and chicken. particularly for pork in the current environment. Access to and sustaining export growth is essential, but really for all three species, to support the size of the industry in the U.S., we need to sustain a presence in a global world that wants to be partially in the U.S. So this is a real concern I have, big picture. Second, I think we have to ask the question, what's the role of government within the industry going forward? I don't know what the outcome of some current investigations and calls for investigations are going to be. That's way beyond my ability to predict, and I'm not going to get into the politics of that here today, but those discussions are pretty hot at the moment. What I want to highlight is there's always unintended consequences from these things, and we need to be cognizant of what the impacts might be on realized innovation and risk-taking within the industry, and ultimately what that means for global comparative advantage of the U.S. system compared to others. I'm quite concerned that if you change the economic incentives within the industry, even if that's not the intention, but if that happens, that erodes the global comparative advantage in the long game. And then finally, circling back to the pivot and the challenges we're having right now with food service being shrunk and some logistical challenges on the export front, one has to ask the question, how much adjustment in the supply chain is going to be post-COVID? Will we move away from a little bit of a just-in-time approach that targets retail food service and or exports and move to something that's a little bit more general, more flexible, can absorb these kind of shocks a little bit better? I don't know, but there's a lot of talk in that space. And the longer this goes on, the more likely those changes are to persist. My pause and reason I bring it up is we need to ask ourselves, what's the cost of that? There's a lot of economies in scale in why we have operations set up the way we do. And what I would call peacetime, so pre-COVID, that presents a lot of benefits to the industry and certainly to consumers in the form of large supplies of affordable meat in many ways. And we can't lose sight of those benefits as we make those adjustments going forward. My final remarks, I promise. These are a little bit bigger picture, but I feel the need to highlight them. Some of the discussions that I've been having have as much to do with coaching people through relationships as they do me being an economist. I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to be good at that, but it's revealed to me that relationships, they're always important, but they're perhaps more now than ever. Lots of us are at home and don't have the same interaction, as an example. So it's good for your mental health to be aware of the importance of those personal relationships, but it's also essential to have sound context for decision-making. We're obviously all making decision-making in a new high-stress, high-implication realm, and having sound relationships and communicating well is important for that. But it doesn't stop on the personal level. The financial relationships are always important, but even more so now. Talking to your lender regularly is essential. If you haven't already, you need to talk with them about the small business loan and support tools that are now available. That requires active communication. Potentially refi and so forth requires ongoing good communication. And then finally, on the operational front, relationships with you and those you buy or sell products to are always important, but even more so now, particularly if you're a livestock producer who is trying to sell a market animal. So if you run a feedlot or a market hog operation, having a good relationship to know the situation on hook access, shackle access, so to speak, is very important at the moment. It's always important, but the importance of these relationships has certainly been heightened during the last few weeks. Last slide, I put it in green at the top. Green is good, right? Society will prevail. I am not Dr. Doom. Hopefully I didn't come across that way. I have a lot of concerns of things that are changing. And one way to make that point, I've been reading the Wall Street Journal regularly, and in their daily post on the 7th, they noted 100 years earlier, Herbert Hoover made the first presentation by public television. Why am I highlighting that? Society is always coming up with new tools. Technology changes. Society adjusts. We adapt. I have full faith we will. Whether that means a vaccine is better or quicker, maybe that's part of it. Whether that means we get better at communicating via Zoom because we're being forced to figure that out, probably that's part of it. I have full faith we will adjust. The U.S. is going to remain a very large ag producer. It's not doomsday to that level. So I hope I didn't mislead you on some of my comments. I have concerns, and we're in the midst of lots of shocks. But at the end of the day, long game, in aggregate, I remain optimistic for the industry and for society as a whole as a U.S. resident. So with that, Rich, I think I'll pause. I've purposely not looked at the chat so I could plow through this. I'll do that, but remind everybody to type in any other comments they might have.
Thanks, Glynn. There are 3 questions on the chat so far. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type those in. As I mentioned earlier, it's at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon that says chat, and you can type in there. So, Glynn, I'll turn it back to you, and you can get going.
Sure. So, Brett asked the question, do packing plants have the ability to quote-unquote catch up, or will all the cattle being fed be backed up? And that's not unique to cattle. It's important to recognize that for both the hog and cattle complex, the chain was fairly full. We had an awful lot of animals trying to get into the system, so to speak. That directly impacts the ability to play catch up. We're not operating with 3 extra plants that were sitting idle going into this, is really what I'm trying to impress upon you. If that was the case, it'd be pretty easy to catch up and reassign things. That is not the case. I do think that both hogs and cattle, there was a strong effort to pull animals forward. So run the plants hard, get as many animals through as we could before the labor challenge within the plant started hitting, which we've seen this week. The net of those 2 is still being fleshed out. I recorded USDA's numbers before we started talking here today, and I'm going to pull them up, make sure I tell you right. So through today, which remember today's Thursday, and it is a holiday week to boot, but there's 11% fewer cattle processed, total slaughter was this week, than through 4 days last week. And on hogs, we were 2% lower. So how much of an effect have we had so far? We're seeing some, but not drastic yet. The ability to play catch up will be on how much did we succeed in pulling the animals forward early, and how are we able to run double shifts and push hard on Saturdays once we're green lighted to do that. Labor availability will have a lot to say with that. So I'm not smart enough to say, yeah, we can play catch up. I am smart enough to say we're going to have heavier animals because it's very hard to put an animal on pause. We can slow down the growth by changing the ration and not pushing them, but we run the risk of heavy animals for sure. Question. Do you think COVID-related labor issues will encourage more packing plant automation in the long run? From Russ Wilson. Yes. So in short, I don't think that's unique to the packing sector. All parts of the economy are always making labor versus capital investment decisions. Human health and the uncertainty of a human relative to automation is always part of those stories. And I think it's going to be revealed pretty strongly here. What I can't tell you, so we need some meat scientists and others to join, is what the short-term pragmatic reality that is. So how far are we from being able to process the same number of steers and hogs with a much lower labor force? I can't speak to that because that gets down to the current technology set, but I certainly think that this is going to reveal the economic benefit of that investment, and there'll be more discussion about that. In many ways, think about the dairy cows that walk onto a wheel now. The role of humans in dairy milking is way lower than it was 50 years ago. It's the exact same logic at play here. So yes, is my answer. John asked, if deglobalization is limited to just isolating China and the rest of the world is still open for export, how do you see that impacting protein prices? So that is a possibility. If that would occur, that would largely be the China-U.S. trade dispute. So it's not a step away from globalization. It'd be specific to those 2 countries and powers. How would that play out? That would be much better than entirely stepping away from globalization, because you still have the rest of the world that's growing. There's lots of demand for protein in Asia that is not in China. So that would be good and supportive. In the near term, if that's what happens, that would be pretty bearish for the hog complex, because we still have the aftermath of African swine fever. Now we have the hope that China might be coming out of their COVID experience and the economy might be getting up and going. If you add all that up, there's a lot of optimism that China's going to import a lot of animal protein. And if they happen to be the one that doesn't, to your question, that would be pretty bearish, particularly for the hog complex. But I would certainly rather see that development than the entire globe move away from trade, to answer your question, because a multi-country step away would have more dire impact on the entire ag complex. How do you think land values will be impacted by COVID? Well, I need to take a drink, and I see Michael is here, so I'm going to let her answer that one.
Well, if I answer that one now, then nobody's going to show up next week, right? I think there's some competing issues. I was on the phone with a realtor today, and we were kind of talking through some of this. And what we've seen is that we've got farmers who are probably not in the best, or most farmers who are not in a position to be buying land. But you've got some that still are. And then you've got some outside investors that are looking at low interest rates and just the availability of land, and they're potentially coming in and bidding up land above where you might see it if you were just had a local sale. So I see some potentially offsetting impacts, but I think I'm going to come back to this a little bit next week and just talk about the supply of land and why people are selling, and what's motivating those sales, as well as the demand side of things. And so we'll talk about that more next week, but I see it as potentially being really hard to predict a solid up or a solid down on land values because of some offsetting factors.
Thank you, Michael. So John asked if cattle, quote unquote, back up as I suggested in my earlier response because of issues that packers are having here. What does that mean in practical terms? Practical terms are we have heavier animals, those that we're trying to market and we can't. Also, equally practical is the average feed yard that's in that situation is likely going to slow their interest in placements. So they're buying time in many ways if they can, and their interest in buying animals coming in, which would force squeezing an animal out when they're having a hard time getting animals out, is going to decline. So I would argue you already see that at play is reduced demand for feeder cattle, but that could exacerbate that challenge. If I'm running a feed yard and I'm having a hard time selling my heavyweights, if I can buy time, particularly if I think I just need to buy a week, it's a game changer if we're talking 6 weeks. But if I think I just need to buy a week or 10 days, that's what you're going to do. You're going to alter the flow of the animals and delay placements, or pay a lot less for placements, and therefore reduce the flow of those feeder cattle. So I think you will see downward pressure on feeder cattle prices get even stronger if that occurs, is a practical implication. I also think another one is everybody that has a consulting nutritionist is going to work hard with them to cheapen the ration and give a ration that puts the animal in a maintenance mode closer than a growth mode to mitigate the effect of having too big of animals once we're able to market them. Alan asked, will this COVID experience prompt consumers to move more towards alt protein substitutes than away from traditional animal protein? That's a good question. My initial reaction, if you just follow Twitter and pictures from the meat and livestock friendly sector, is there's a lot of pictures floating around from grocery stores during the hoarding experience where plant-based items that are available are still on the shelf when a regular package of ground beef and sausage is not. So that would suggest that those products are not in high demand by the average person today. I would agree with that. But my pause is the average person is yet to be the target because those products are not cheap. We're not to that point yet with those products. And secondly, some people in the US might actually be exposed to those products because they went to a grocery store and they didn't have access to a traditional ground beef package or sausage package that time. And they were of the mindset, I need to take some protein home because I don't know if I'll be allowed to come back or it's going to be 10 days or whatever. So if you're hearing me out, I think the average person wasn't the target and they revealed it wasn't their first choice. But my gut tells me there's some people that are being exposed to it that didn't plan to be exposed because that was the protein that was available to them as they went through the store. We're going to see the net of that. For what it's worth, the stock market beat up those companies pretty hard as it saw the information on that, became more pessimistic. But I don't think those products are going to go away. I've given whole talks on that, and we could probably do that in a different study. Daryl asked, with the headlines about milk being dumped due to logistical challenges and rising feed costs, except corn, because there's a lack of distillers availability, how concerned are you with the dairy industry's financial state? Well, the most genuine response is, of the species I've alluded to here, dairy is the one I interact the least with. So I first and foremost have to tell you I'm not as deep on the dairy side as I am the others. I I am concerned because it's been a while since there was a good, profitable situation for the representative dairy firm going into this. So the ability to absorb this shock is pretty limited. But I don't know the extent of governmental assistance. It's important to note that the dairy sector is often highlighted in a different way than other sectors within our economy when it comes to governmental federal assistance. I don't know what the final outcome of that's going to be, but the dairy industry has its own ask at the table in DC, and I don't really want to get into the weeds of that because I'm not privy to give details at this stage. But depending upon the outcome of that, that could have a lot to do with how many that were truly underwater were able to survive. And I'm not bright enough to tell you the extent of that federal support that's going to be there. In the absence of it, I think you're going to have notable fallout from those that were not well positioned, which was the quote unquote smaller, not price protected operation who has a co-op telling them they got to dump their milk. Brett asked the question, what leverage do hog producers have in setting price? And what is the function of hog futures market without a cash market? Oh, Brett. So I alluded to this earlier, is very small percentage of hogs are cash negotiated now. There's individual weeks where it's below 2%. Very rarely does it hit 5% now. It's much more common that hogs are sold off a relationship tied to something else. In some cases, it is to the CME, which is indirectly what you're alluding to a little bit. Some cases, it's to the cutout. It's also important to recognize that more hog producers today actually are owners in the processing industry than was the case 10 years ago. Some of the growth and capacity for the processing side is from producer ownership. I'm giving you that response because we really can't talk about price discovery just in general in the hog industry like we can other industries, because exactly the relationships that are in place on how people transact market hogs is quite diverse, and very, very few are still contingent upon the negotiated cash market directly. We can come back to that if you want more on that. Dan. Glenn, how far along is China in recovering from African swine fever damage? How do I say this? Lots of mixed reports. So I'm not sure how much people believe the reports. So that's a hard one to respond to. The one I do know with certainty is the Chinese government and the ag sector itself has pulled the trigger hard on producing pork. So they've put in motion their effort to produce pork in the future. That's not the same as wiping the African swine fever out and being past it. I don't want to mislead us, but it is relevant for them being in position to produce a lot of pork and not need to import as much, maybe in the near future. So I'm more confident that they've got those wheels in motion to become less dependent on imports than I am any speculation about ASF on the ground today. George asked, do you have any information on the $9.5 billion that USDA has gotten for the meat and dairy industry? What I can tell you today in a public setting is the beef cattle industry is on the list that is eligible for that $9.5 billion. They are not the only ones. So there's other groups as well. Those multiple groups are in the process of submitting their damage/ask list to DC, and USDA is going to receive those and then respond on how they allocate the $9.5 billion, what rules are associated with that, and how it's implemented. That's all I can tell you now. I am confident that before the weekend is over, that all the major groups involved will have their ask and their numbers into DC. Quite a bit of that's already done, and I think will be for sure by the time Easter weekend's over. What I can't predict is the speed and ability for USDA to assess, compare that with the $9.5 billion, and make the allocations. That's a USDA governmental decision. Terry asked, do you see any large adjustment in feed use for animal units and or cattle? Cattle for, I'm guessing for the rest of the year, 2020. We have a lot of animals in the system, right? I mean, remember, all the major species, biological things are in place. We're not changing the number of animals that are here. with one exception of discussion about euthanizing little pigs, which we can come back to that if you want. There's market signals at times to do that. But in aggregate, the animals that are in place to consume corn, soybean meal, et al. Products are largely here and known for 2020. Where we're getting at is what those market weights and target market weights would be and how that nudges the amount of corn and the amount of soybean meal and so forth we need. And there may be some adjustment in those weights, but not drastic. So I personally don't think you're going to see a big change in feed use between now and, let's say, Labor Day, because the vast majority of that is already set by hooves on the ground. We can tweak the market weights, but the hooves on the ground are pretty much set. Will the effect of COVID-19 jumping from wild animals sold in wet markets in some countries have an effect on consumption of meat in the U.S.? John asked that question. And related, recently in the news, we found COVID in a tiger in a zoo. So there's concern of what animals might carry the virus. To date, my understanding is it does not show up in swine, cattle, so forth. I obviously hope that persists. What you're really getting at is consumer perception and comfort with animal protein products being safe. That's always hard to predict. Lots of the stuff I work with says safety is paramount. It is probably one of the three most important things when somebody makes a meat purchasing decision. So if they become convinced it's not safe, they'll step away. But I will tell you that things like African swine fever have not to date caused, a step back on pork demand, for example, here in the States and so forth. So there's several examples to where, in that example, the pork industry has successfully communicated well that there's not a human health concern, and therefore we sustained pork demand in that story. There's not been that ASF hit in that example. I'll be optimistic that COVID is that way until proven otherwise. I also think in the current environment, we all have time to back up and think through what really matters and do a little more homework. You can read more, maybe not all, I'm talking more just the quote unquote typical person who's spending more time at home now has an opportunity to get on the web and read. That's a double-edged sword because they can read inaccurate information on Twitter or whatever. But to the extent that the industry, whether it is the beef industry, the pork industry, whatever, can put out good, sound information, it's probably going to be more accessible to the general public than it would have been pre the lockdown. So we have an opportunity to mitigate those negative effects. The last one, the cow-calf guy will sell soon at the sale barn unhedged. What is your suggestion on being able to capture some of that loss back? I.e., should he buy some calls? The cow-calf guy, this depends on exactly when they have cows. So let's talk through the different timing. Roughly 3/4 of the calves are sold in this country in the fall because they're born in the spring. So we have that chunk. Those are going to be hitting the market, let's say September through November. Physically, yes, there's a downward price pressure on those markets right now, but the physical activity is then. Conversely, the other fourth would be selling now. So those that had calves last fall, marketing in the spring, would be in the middle of what you're talking about, and they may not have a time horizon to recover, if that's what you're referring to. So if it's the marketing of animals today, it's going to be very hard to recover, to answer your question. And I will not just broadly say buy-in calls and so forth is good advice. That depends a lot on the person and their equity position, all those kind of things. And options can be quite expensive, so it may not make sense. So I won't just outright endorse that. What I will highlight for those that are selling in the fall, which is about 3/4 of the national production, is most don't hedge typically. Most have not locked in a price decline. As of today, there is a projected price decline, but it's not realized for those folks that haven't taken action until they sell in October and November. And in many ways, it's a wait and see game. And you have to ask yourself, if there's a rally in the feeder cattle market, do I want to lock in some of those gains? So I highlight that because one of the slides I prepped here is one of the questions that was submitted. And in many ways, it's exactly the one that was typed in the chat. Should I hold my feeder cattle or sell them now? Well, you have to ask yourself, do you think we're at the end of the COVID experience or not? Are you comfortable with the extended price risk exposure that comes with delaying taking action? I would encourage you to use beefbasis.com to compare what the market is saying the benefits of waiting will be. And then at the end of the day, the very last one here, which is most relevant for your question, use tools like this one that we have on our Ag Manager website to compare the alternatives. So comparing, buying an option, having a futures hedge, and just being on the cash market, that is the purpose of that tool. So I encourage you to use it to answer that question for yourself. All right, I'm going to pause there and let my colleagues jump in if they have something. I think I got through the questions on chat, but Rich will tell me if I missed one.
Yes, you have so far anyway. There hasn't been anything else.
So while people are typing more in, I'm going to flip. When you guys registered, a few of you submitted questions. So I believe there's 4 slides I made that are at the end of this. One of the questions that came in as part of the registration is, should I retain ownership and sell as fed cattle? So instead of selling my calves, this fall, what if I already have feeder cattle? Should I own them longer? Even pre-COVID, the questions I ask are, has that producer that's asking, have they ever retained ownership before or not? It requires a relationship with the feedlot to do that. So you need those relationships. Have you done some homework on how volatile the margins in the feedlot sector are? There's lots of information on that, but I put a link to the monthly information I put out. And then you have to ask yourself, what will my lender think? You don't have to do what your lender says wholly. If you're in an equity position, you may be able to do it without that. But I would encourage you to think about it that way, because you certainly are taking on more price risk and delaying revenue for your operation when you do that. It might be perfectly rational, but you have to be very comfortable with that reality. To cut through all that, if you just want an outright opinion, if COVID is winding down, and if you think the economy is going to come back up earlier rather than later, those are both ifs, and I can't really tell you. But if you believe yes to both of those, then I think you'll be rewarded by being exposed to the market, and all cattle, actually the entire livestock complex in many ways, will improve compared to today. But it hinges on a yes to those first two. The macroeconomic pressure in the form of demand that I alluded to earlier hinges on us being towards the end of COVID and the economy getting back up and going. Cool cow question, should I hold them or not? You need to know what your cost of gain is if you're going to hold them. What's it cost you to put more additional pounds on? That's always the question to ask. As a quick point of context, in the past, about 3 years ago, I looked at this. A rule of thumb between the cool cow market and calf market, because a cow-calf operator has both, those are the main sources of revenue, is cool cows are usually worth about 44 cents on the dollar for what a calf is worth. So at any point in time when you're making this assessment, for example, if cool cow is worth 30% of what a calf is, all else equal, that's a signal for you to hold on to your cool cow and put some weight on. But if the cool cow is worth 50% the price of calves, the market's telling you to do the opposite. So you can think through that as well. Always be comparing that to your own cost of gain of putting those pounds on. The last one, I've already answered this, but just to be respectful of it being submitted, one of the questions was a comment. My understanding is the Ag Secretary, which I'm going to interpret as USDA, is looking at things. I presume that comment was referring to investigations and looking into things in the marketplace. I'm not in position to speculate what governmental policy is going to be or what reports are going to say, or honestly, even when the reports are going to come out. We're still waiting on a report from USDA following the Holcomb fire. So I can't give you any more than that at this point. Brady just typed in, what's COVID's impact on the South American beef production system? Any insight here? You're asking me to speculate. So coronavirus is in the Southern Hemisphere now. We don't know, and I am getting a little out of my comfort zone saying this, but I think it's important to recognize we don't know the extent that there's seasonal temperature effects on coronavirus spread. There's some people that think there's an effect when it's warm, it dies out and so forth, but we don't know that certainly yet. I'm highlighting that because we're going to flip seasons with South America, and there are some concern that coronavirus will be on an opposite cycle in the South and the North in some sense. That gets into details of the virus and so forth that I can't really predict, but it is important to note that Brazil in particular, but as well as Argentina and Uruguay, are home to quite a few of the beef exporting competitors for the U.S. And they certainly, in Brazil's case, are home to large poultry and pork production systems. So to the extent that those countries, and let's just say Brazil specifically, have ag labor challenges, that will mitigate their effect to produce and put protein out on the global market. I suspect they're going to have challenges just like we're having this week in the packing complex here in the U.S. How big those are is way beyond my ability to predict. So Shelley just typed in, there's a strong connection between the livestock industry and ethanol, not only distillers, but also CO2 capture for chilling processed meats. With the sharp decline in ethanol production, how much corn will be absorbed by the livestock industry compared to the loss of use for ethanol? Dan's welcome to jump in here, and I'm going to ask him to in a second, because it's storable, not for 20 years, but it's not perishable like a meat product. So you have the decision about whether to market it or store it, given the signals on what it costs to store. That's going to have an effect on that too. I highlight it because the demand for corn is obviously changed by ethanol plants shrinking, right? Their demand for corn goes down. That's not good for corn price, all else equal. Lower corn price is attractive for livestock producers, right? Lower corn price sends a signal to produce heavier weight animals, all else equal. So the interest in absorbing a little more corn would be there if we're able to run the plants, right? There's not an interest for heavier weights if the plants are behind. That's the catch-22 for the next 1 to 3 weeks, I think, is the challenge about the bottleneck in the packing sector is going to discourage heavyweight animals because they're going to be coming by slowing, by us not being able to run the animals at the time we want. So the signal to buy cheaper corn and put heavier weights on is mitigated when the packing sector is having labor challenges and operating challenges. If you're asking me the question for, say, 3 months from now, if the plants are running quote unquote like normal and we still have the ethanol situation you're talking about, such that corn is cheaper than it would have been otherwise, then yes, I think the livestock sector will absorb more of that corn because then they'll be in a position to have an incentive to put heavier weights on. So I think it's a duration difference to answer your question. And Dan, you typed in a chat comment. You can add to that verbally if you want.
Yeah, Shelley, if I understand what you're asking, probably would go look at today and what the supply demand balance sheet had done. When you look at feed grains overall, had a combined cutback in feed grain usage for corn and sorghum of a total of 400 million bushels, an increase in feed use of, corn was up 150, sorghum was down 25, so net 125. So that's about a 33%. So we cut back ethanol usage for those feed grains about 400 million, and about a third back, 125 million increase on the feed side. Is that getting at some of your thoughts on that? There's probably the other factor on that, and we talked about this some last week, has to do with the substitution of distillers' grains, again, i.e. not being available because you've cut back on ethanol, and then now you're bringing back in the corn to sub back on that. So that ratio we just talked about isn't far off of the discussion we had last week. I think we were going at, say, 200 million cut back in ethanol. We were going to have to compensate about 70 million more corn. Well, you know what? I think we've just about done that with the supply demand balance sheet changes that happened today.
So I just remembered another component. One of the questions was the ability of the packing sector to play catch up. I think it's important to recognize that in normal times, we have plants that process steers and heifers and other plants that handle cull cows. But in abnormal times, there are examples where the cull cow plants have taken on steers and heifers when the economic signals are there or when the quote unquote need is there. I do think there's a possibility for part of that quote unquote catch up that the plants that normally handle cull cows will handle some steers and heifers. I should have added that to my answer earlier. That's not a saving grace for the industry in aggregate, but it can help ease the pain a little bit to play catch up that I should have said earlier. So while I'm waiting, in case there's a couple more, I'm going to take the liberty to click forward. One of the questions, you guys will see this in your final slide deck. One of the questions, I believe Brett's the one that asked me, as it relates to pricing of hogs and so forth. I pulled together 2 slides on this point, and here's the links again from AMS information. But April 8th, barrel and gilt prices, different categories, and you can read this, but 1% of the animals that day, 1.1 specifically, were in the negotiated bucket. The largest bucket was swine or pork market formula. Other purchase arrangements, which are unique, they have other things going on, a stall-free claim, an antibiotic-free claim, no beta agonist, lots of those kind of things fall into that bucket, show up. And then those that are tied to the futures and market or options, the formula, all of those are much more prevalent and representative of how we produce hogs and market hogs than the negotiated bucket. That was embedded in my answer earlier, but you see this week after week. This is just the current version of it. What gets lost in this, though, is the price differential. And you can see, for example, the carcass price, second row on this chart for negotiated is $40 versus, and I can't read this because your all's pictures are on my road. Let me move this. The weighted average is $49.23. That $9 difference gets the attention of a lot of people. I understand that. But what I think is really important to appreciate is the $40 is basically being received by 1% of the hogs. A much more representative number of the price of hogs on that day is $49. So the weighted average across all hogs is 49 because of the different ways they're marketed and the different types of systems. 49 represents the market much more than 40. Point number one I was trying to allude to. Point number two, the gap between negotiated and all others tends to widen notably during times of economic shock. And we're in the midst of adverse shock. So negotiated tends to be depressed notably compared to the other buckets in bad times. We've seen that before. But it also tends to be higher than the others in good times. And the reason I'm highlighting is negotiated is in some sense the residual bucket in the industry. It's the one that wasn't priced ahead of time or tied. And it's the one that is most sensitive to the current economic environment. And we're obviously in a unique economic environment. So I hope that additional context is helpful for the question. Anybody can track this. Go to that AMS link, daily info.
Folks, last call. Be glad to have something else if you have it, not just on the cattle markets, but anything else you have, grain markets, land values, the macro economy, crop production stuff. And we do have something from John.
So John Campbell asked, at the retail end, markets are out of ground beef, but cattle prices are down. What gives? So lots of discussion in that space. More generally, why is there a spread that has time variability between fed cattle and the cut out? Packer margins are always part of that story and so forth. What I'll go all the way back as part of my answer to that, just so we all can recognize this. Right here. So the choice beef cutout I alluded to earlier. The only primals that are up since the middle of March are the ones tied to ground beef, consistent with your question, but all the other ones are down. The overall composite is still up 7%. I'm quite pessimistic that's going to hold. I think there's notable pressure. Aggregate beef demand is negative. It's coming down. I'm confident that the cost of running a plant is higher this past week than it was same week last year. So the cost aspect of this has changed. I'm highlighting that because all the commentary you see in the news is gross margin, because that's what's publicly observed at the packing sector, not net. Certainly there's been times that the gross margin has been quite wide, and we know with confidence that there's been a wide net margin and profitability. I'm not hiding that, but it's really important in the current environment to recognize that the gross margin does not reflect the net, because we know there's notable changes in the cost side. Idling and cleaning more, paying labor more, potentially having fewer people there to process the same number of animals, so to speak. All of those things raise the cost of operating. I don't mean that in any way to defend one sector over another, but I think we got to be very careful to not treat gross and net the same. We have to recognize that it's the collective value of the animal and the economics behind that are at play. And ground beef is just a component of the products we get off an animal. I was trying to allude to that up front. You've got a similar story on, why is bacon depressed so much more than other products in the pork complex? These things are not uniform. Ground beef is way up. Other products are not. For about 3 weeks in a row here in Manhattan, I could buy a pretty decent steak at my grocery store for $1 a pound more than ground beef. That's not normally the case. The reason it's occurred is there's been a demand spike for ground beef in the retail sector. At the same time, I just told you steak was pretty cheap. The net of that shows up in these numbers. So that's my answer on what gives, or more accurately, why that's occurring. The other addendum to that, while we're waiting or before we call it good, I guess, we are at a point where there's a lot of cattle relative to available capacity. It's embedded in the whole impact of the closures also. When you're at that point, the term leverage gets used in the industry. That can be misleading, but the way to think about it is if you got a lot of cattle chasing a fairly small number of hooks and access, that's not favorable for supporting fed cattle prices compared to a situation where maybe you have the exact same number of plants and capacity, but 15% fewer fed animals. In that capacity, you'd have fewer animals chasing those hooks, and then the negotiation power changes. Over time, the relative fit between the number of animals and the capacity in the industry is changing. That's always the case in all industries. And at this point in time, both for the hog and the cattle complex, we have a lot of animals relative to packing capacity. Have you calculated the gross profit for the cow-calf producer to compare to the packer? There's time series on cow-calf profitability on our Ag Manager website that we can allude to. In many years, actual economic profit is not there for a cow-calf producer if you account for all activity. If you just look at covering variable cost as opposed to covering total cost, you can find positive story. The reason I'm highlighting that is those that don't put full value on their feed, land, or labor approach the topic of profit in the cow-calf sector a lot differently than PhD geeks like me would do. We tend to count all the costs, and that makes the margin look worse, so to speak. But yes, we do that. I just alluded to the fact that we don't have full cost info on the packing sector. So I do not have a time series of profitability for the packing sector. That is not something that's publicly available. I'm going to take the liberty to go further because I know it's in the news, just because I have the mic and Rich will tell me when I need to stop. Embedded in those inquiries often is discussion about farmer share of the retail dollar. That often comes up, and it's maybe in your mind when you ask the question, sir. I would encourage you to be very careful overreacting to that statistic. And the main reason for that is that statistic is often interpreted and thought through in the sense of a fixed size of an economic pie. The best way I know to make this point is back to my fear on globalization. If we can no longer export meat for some reason, whatever the reason, all of a sudden, per capita consumption will go up in the US. That itself is not a good thing. But the pie split between domestic use and foreign exports would change, and you'd have a higher share staying domestically. The fixed pie mindset of that is very misleading. Over time, there's a lot of investments that happen post-farm gate, whether it's post-seed stock, post-cow-calf, post-feedlot, all the way through the chain, that improve the demand for meat products. The simple example I give is deboning. A lot of people in the US, at least not during COVID times, but in general, will pay a notable premium for a boneless product. That's all done post-live animal. Those investments are part of the reason that you have a splitting of the retail dollar, and not all those investments are made the same way and aligned with consumer demand and so forth. So a plea is to not overreact to the share of the retail dollar. It's also a biased statistic because the retail dollar is not accurate, but that's for a different day. I hope I answered your question. I'll stop there. Michael, there's a question from John. Do you see it in the chat?
That's possible. I mean, it's possible that you're paying too much for grazing land if that's the situation, and if it holds for longer than a season. Some people might still be negotiating rental rates, but most folks are probably done negotiating rental rates for the season and they're locked in. The question remains whether or not you can adjust those rental rates next year to reflect a cattle market that might still be down. Hopefully it's not, but if it is, then there would be the opportunity to negotiate down those rental rates. some of the things that Glenn has talked about tonight are short run and some of them are long run. And the extent to which the long run effects come into play, that's where I think we start to see rental rate adjustments and land value adjustments. Yeah, every time I turn my microphone on, I'm afraid that people can hear my dog snoring in the background. So I'm trying to keep my mic off.
Well, I'll take the liberty to brag about my 3 kids. If I'm not hearing them, I hope that means you guys don't hear them. So.
We haven't heard your kids and we haven't heard the dog and haven't heard any lawnmowers or anything like that. So thanks all. I think maybe we're done. Thanks Brady for the comment. We've got one more next week with Michael's land values, and I'll include the link for that when I send out the link for the recording of this thing tonight. And so we're glad you could join us. Thanks very much. If you should have something else you think of, you can send me an email and I'll get it to whoever it needs to be. Thanks for joining us.